On October 14, 1912, a man stood before a crowd in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and did something that defied the laws of biology and the expectations of modern medicine. He had just been shot at point-blank range by a fanatic. The bullet, a .38 caliber slug, had ripped through a steel spectacle case, bored through a 50-page manuscript tucked into his breast pocket, and lodged itself deep in his chest, mere inches from his heart. His aides screamed for a doctor. The crowd surged in a murderous panic. But the man, thick-necked, bespectacled, and vibrating with an almost supernatural energy, clutched his side, coughed into his hand to see if he was spitting blood, and seeing none, he ordered his driver to proceed to the auditorium. When he stepped onto the stage, he did not ask for sympathy. He looked at the gasping audience and said, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He spoke for 90 minutes. He spoke until the blood had soaked through his shirt and undershirt, staining the very manuscript that had slowed the bullet's path. This was Theodore Roosevelt. And to understand Theodore Roosevelt, one must understand that this was not an isolated act of bravado. It was the logical conclusion of a life built entirely on the foundation of the strenuous life. He was a man who decided, through sheer grinding effort, to become the most vital version of himself, and in doing so, he brought the United States of America into the 20th century with him. To look at the face of Theodore Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore today is to see a titan of history, a static icon of American resolve. But the man behind the granite was far more complex. He was a sickly, asthmatic boy who became a champion boxer, a Harvard intellect who became a Dakota cowboy, a grieving widower who became a war hero, and an accidental president who became the first truly modern executive. He was a naturalist who could identify every birdsong in the forest, a prolific author who wrote over 35 books, and a Nobel Peace Prize winner who simultaneously obsessed over the expansion of American naval might. As we begin this journey through his life, we are not just looking at a biography of a politician. We are looking at a masterclass in human will. We are tracing the arc of a man who believed that the mighty days were not behind us, but ahead. We are exploring the life of a man who lived at a red heat, who viewed every obstacle, be it physical infirmity, a political machine, or a literal bullet, as something to be charged at full tilt. Our story begins in a brownstone in New York City, in a room smelling of medicine and struggle, where a frantic child fought for his next breath. It moves to the rugged, sun-scorched Badlands of the West, where a broken-hearted man sought to bury his grief in the hard work of the saddle. It carries us to the heights of San Juan Hill, where a volunteer colonel transformed himself into a legend, and eventually to the White House, where the bully pulpit was used to dismantle monopolies, protect the American wilderness, and bridge two oceans with the Panama Canal. Finally, it follows an elder lion into the depths of the Amazon rainforest, where he nearly met his end in a pursuit of discovery that most men half his age wouldn't dare attempt. Wherever you are in the world, and whether you're going for a walk, having a rest, or going off to bed for the night, I hope you enjoy this story. If you do enjoy this story, like and subscribe for more stories like this. And if there was one thing Theodore Roosevelt loved above all else, it was nature. In fact, most of the national parks we have today are because of Theodore Roosevelt. So, in the comments, let me know, when was the last time you went to a national park, and which one was it? Now let's get back to the story of the life of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt once famously said, "The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." Over our time here together, we are going to step into that arena with him. We are going to see the dust of the Dakota plains, the sweat of the jungle, and the blood on that Milwaukee stage. We will see a man who was often criticized for being too loud, too aggressive, and too impulsive, but a man who was never, ever accused of being indifferent. By the time we conclude, I hope you see that TR was not just a president. He was a phenomenon. He was a reminder that life is meant to be spent, not saved. He was the bull moose who refused to lie down, the rough rider who refused to stop charging, and the American who refused to believe that anything was impossible. Let us begin at the beginning, with a small, struggling boy named Teddy, and the father who told him that he must make his body if he ever hoped to use his mind. The first chapter of Theodore Roosevelt's life is perhaps the most vital for anyone seeking to understand the bull moose. It is a story of metamorphosis. We often think of great leaders as having been born with their strength intact, but TR was a self-made man in the most literal physical sense. This period, roughly spanning from his childhood in the 1860s to his return from the Dakota Territory in 1886, is a saga of overcoming infirmity, intellectual awakening, and the kind of soul-crushing grief that would have permanently sidelined a lesser spirit. The Boy in the Window. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858 to a world of New York privilege, but his early years were defined not by wealth, but by a desperate, gasping struggle for air. The boy known as Teddy was a fragile, spindly child plagued with such severe asthma that it was often feared he would not survive the night. In the mid-19th century, there were no inhalers or modern corticosteroids. The treatments were often as harrowing as the disease itself. Things like being forced to smoke strong cigars, or drink black coffee until he was shaking, or being taken on terrifying high-speed carriage rides through the night to force breath into his lungs. There is a poignant image from these years of his father, Theodore Sr., a man of immense physical and moral stature, walking the floors for hours in the middle of the night, carrying his wheezing son in his arms like a bundle of sticks. This relationship was the forge in which TR was shaped. Theodore Sr. was TR's ideal man, a philanthropist, a powerhouse civic virtue, and a man who believed that weakness was a choice. When Teddy was about 12 years old, his father took him aside and delivered the ultimatum that would change the course of American history. He told him, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It is hard drudgery to make it, but I know you will do it." Most children might have been crushed by such a demand. Roosevelt's response was a grit-toothed, "I'll make it." This began the era of the strenuous life in its infancy. The Roosevelts installed a gymnasium on the wide porch of their home. There, the young Teddy spent hours every day on the horizontal bars, the rings, and the punching bag. He was not a natural athlete. He was clumsy, his eyesight was failing, though he didn't realize this until he got his first pair of spectacles shortly after, and he was painfully thin, but he had a will like a hydraulic press. He was not just exercising, he was declaring war on his own biology. The naturalist's eye. While he was making his body, Teddy was also cultivating an obsession that would remain his greatest solace until his dying day: natural history. He was not merely a boy who liked bugs. He was a rigorous, self-taught scientist. At age 7, he established the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History in his bedroom. He learned the art of taxidermy, filling the family home with the smell of arsenic and the sight of stuffed squirrels and birds. To the young Roosevelt, the natural world was a puzzle to be solved. He kept meticulous journals, recording the plumage of birds and the habits of mice with the precision of a veteran biologist. This wasn't a hobby, it was his primary identity. Long before he ever dreamed of being a politician, Theodore Roosevelt intended to be a professional naturalist in the vein of Audubon or Darwin. This naturalist's eye, the ability to observe, categorize, and appreciate the interconnectedness of an ecosystem, would later inform his revolutionary views on conservation. Harvard and the boxing ring. By the time he entered Harvard in 1876, the transformation was well underway. He was no longer the deathly ill child. He was a whirlwind of energy. At Harvard, he was famously too much for many of his peers. He would run to his classes. He would interrupt professors with a barrage of questions. He was a dandy who wore exquisite clothes, Yet he was also the man who joined the boxing team. His boxing career at Harvard is a perfect microcosm of his character. He was not particularly good, he lacked the reach and the natural grace of a fighter, but he was utterly fearless. In one famous bout, after the round had ended, his opponent landed a late blow that bloodied Roosevelt's nose. The crowd hissed and booed at the foul, but Roosevelt, with blood streaming down his face, reportedly shushed the crowd and yelled, "He didn't hear the bell," and shook the man's hand. He valued sand, the Victorian term for grit, above almost any other virtue. It was also during his time at Harvard that he met Alice Hathaway Lee. Alice was the sunshine of his life, a beautiful, charming woman who seemed to soften the jagged edges of Roosevelt's relentless intensity. They were married in 1880, and for a brief window of time, Roosevelt's life seemed to be a scripted Victorian success story. He had conquered his illness, graduated with honors, published a definitive history of the Naval War of 1812, and won a seat in the New York State Assembly at the age of 23. The Dark Day, February 14, 1884. Then the world broke. In early 1884, Roosevelt was in Albany, making a name for himself as a reformist firebrand, when he received word that his wife had given birth to their first child, a daughter. But the joy was short-lived. A second telegram arrived, urgent and terrifying. He rushed back to New York City to find his home a house of mourning. In a cruel twist of fate that seemed too tragic for fiction, Roosevelt's mother, Mittie, was dying of typhoid fever on the first floor, and upstairs his beloved Alice was dying of Bright's disease, kidney failure, which had been masked by her pregnancy. Roosevelt moved from bedside to bedside. His mother died first. A few hours later, Alice died in his arms. In his diary for that day, he drew a heavy black X and wrote one sentence: "The light has gone out of my life." He never spoke Alice's name again. He didn't even mention her in his autobiography. He simply took the grief and, in his typical fashion, tried to outrun it. He left his infant daughter in the care of his sister and fled. He didn't just leave the city. He left the civilization he knew entirely. He headed west to the Dakota Territory, to a place where he said, "The romance of my life began." The Badlands, the Eastern Dude and the Cowboy. When Roosevelt arrived in Medora, Dakota Territory, in June 1884, the locals thought he was a joke. He was a four-eyed New Yorker in a fringed buckskin suit with a silver-hilted Bowie knife and a custom-made Tiffany-engraved rifle. He was the ultimate Eastern Dude. But the Badlands did not care about his Harvard degree or his New York lineage. The environment was brutal, the work was grueling, and the men worked hard. Roosevelt threw himself into the life of a rancher with the desperation born of sorrow. He bought two ranches, the Chimney Butte and the Elkhorn, and began a 2-year immersion in the strenuous life of the frontier. He spent 16 hours a day in the saddle. He participated in roundups, branded cattle, and slept on the frozen ground with nothing but a thin blanket. He didn't ask for special treatment. When he fell off his horse, which he did frequently, he got back up. When he was mocked, he laughed it off, or, if necessary, used his boxing skills he'd honed at Harvard. The turning point in his reputation came at a saloon in a tiny town called Mingusville. A drunken bully with a gun in each hand was terrorizing the patrons, calling Roosevelt Four Eyes and ordering him to buy drinks for the house. Roosevelt stood up, seemingly compliant, then delivered a 3-punch combination that knocked the man unconscious. Then he went back to his reading. The Eastern Dude was gone. The old 22, his ranch brand nickname, had arrived. The Manhunt and the River. Perhaps the most Rooseveltian moment in his Dakota years was the pursuit of the boat thieves. In the spring of 1886, 3 outlaws stole a wooden boat from his Elkhorn ranch to escape down the Little Missouri River. Most ranchers would have let it go or waited for a marshal. Roosevelt, however, viewed the theft as a personal affront to the rule of law. He and two of his ranch hands built another boat in a matter of days and set off down the ice-choked river in pursuit. They caught the thieves in a daring ambush, but then came the hard part. They couldn't just hang them. Roosevelt was, after all, a man of the law, and the river was too jammed with ice to return by boat. So Roosevelt marched the prisoners overland for 3 days through a blizzard. To keep himself awake while guarding them at night so his men could sleep, he read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. When they finally reached a jail, the sheriff was stunned. No one had ever gone to such lengths for a $20 boat. But for TR, it wasn't about the boat. It was about the principle. The emergence of the lion. By 1886, the Badlands had done what the gym in New York could not. They had finished making Theodore Roosevelt. The grief that had driven him west had been cauterized by the sun, the wind, and the hard labor of the ranch. He had become a man of the people, not through a political script, but through shared hardship. He understood the cowboy, the farmer, and the laborer because he had lived their lives. He returned to New York with a barrel chest, a booming voice, and a perspective that was no longer confined to the elite salons of Manhattan. He had seen the vastness of the American continent. He had seen how quickly the wilderness was disappearing, and he had seen the character of the men who built the country from the dirt up. The making of a naturalist was complete. He was no longer just a scientist or a grieving widower. He was a man who knew that life was a struggle, and that the only way to live it was to charge. Act 1 had provided the armor. Act 2 would provide the arena. He was ready to return to the world of men and begin the climb that would lead him, eventually, to the highest office in the land. About his self-discovery in the West, he wrote, "I have always said I would not have been president had it not been for my experience in North Dakota. It was in the silence of the prairies and the grit of the cattle drive that the sickly boy from New York finally found the man he was meant to be." Act 2. If Act 1 was about the internal forging of a man, Act 2 is the saga of a man colliding with the world. This is the period from 1886 to 1901, a 15-year whirlwind where Theodore Roosevelt transformed himself from a reformer with a hobby into the most famous man in the Western Hemisphere. To understand his path to power, one must understand that TR did not follow a traditional political map. He treated every minor office as if it were a battlefield, and every bureaucratic desk as if it were a bully pulpit in waiting. The return to the fray, building a home front. When Roosevelt returned to New York from the Badlands in 1886, he was a man transformed. The Eastern dude had been replaced by a barrel-chested, sunburnt ranchman with a voice that carried across prairies. The West had cauterized his grief, but it had not diminished his ambition. If anything, the silence of the Dakota plains had given him time to sharpen his vision for what America could be. He quickly remarried his childhood sweetheart, Edith Caro, in London. Edith would become the bedrock of his life, the only person capable of managing the whirlwind that was Theodore. Together, they began building Sagamore Hill on Long Island, a home that would eventually house 6 children and a collection of trophies that told the story of a man who refused to be still. Sagamore Hill was not just a house, it was the headquarters for the Rooseveltian brand of life, filled with books, boxing gloves, and the constant thundering of children. But the quiet life of a country squire was an impossibility for him. He immediately jumped back into the political arena, running for mayor of New York City in 1886. He was up against a formidable labor candidate, Henry George, and a seasoned Democrat, Abram Hewitt. Roosevelt, running as a Republican reformer, came in third. To many, a third-place finish in a local race would be a career ender. To Roosevelt, it was merely a warm-up. He spent the next few years writing, producing massive volumes like The Winning of the West, while waiting for his next opening. He was a man in wait, but he was never idle. The Civil Service Crusade, War on the Spoils System. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Roosevelt to the United States Civil Service Commission. At the time, the Civil Service Commission was where political careers went to die. It was a toothless body meant to oversee the spoils system, the corrupt practice where politicians gave government jobs to their friends and donors regardless of merit. Most commissioners took the paycheck, attended the mandatory dinners, and kept their head down. Roosevelt, true to form, treated it like a holy war. For 6 years, he waged a relentless campaign against political cronyism. He didn't just sit in Washington, he traveled the country, conducting surprise inspections of post offices and customs houses. He would publicly shame congressmen who tried to bypass the merit rules, regardless of their party. He was learning a vital lesson. If you have the people behind you, and if you have the truth on your side, you can ignore the party bosses. By the time he left Washington in 1895, he had successfully expanded the number of jobs covered by the merit-based rules from 14,000 to over 40,000. More importantly, he had made Theodore Roosevelt a household name for integrity. He had proven that administration efficiency could be as exciting as a cavalry charge if handled with enough energy. The Midnight Commissioner, cleaning up the city. In 1895, Roosevelt returned to his native New York City to serve as the president of the Board of Police Commissioners. The New York City Police Department at the time was perhaps the most corrupt organization in the United States. Officers bought their positions from Tammany Hall, took bribes from every saloon and brothel on their beat, and ignored the law as a matter of professional routine. It was a system built on the squeeze. Roosevelt did not sit in an office reviewing reports. He became the Midnight Commissioner. He would put on a dark cloak and a wide brim hat pulled low over his spectacles and walk the streets of lower Manhattan at 2 a.m. He would catch officers sleeping on duty, drinking in pubs, or shaking down shopkeepers. The next morning, those officers would be summoned to his office to face the teeth, Roosevelt's terrifying toothy grin as he barked orders for their dismissal or discipline. He modernized the force with a naturalist precision. He created the first bicycle squads, the Scorcher Squad, established a police academy, and introduced standardized testing for recruits. But his most famous battle was over the Sunday excise laws, which forbade the sale of alcohol on the Sabbath. While the law was deeply unpopular, Roosevelt insisted on enforcing it simply because it was the law. This caused a massive backlash from the city's working class and immigrant communities. But TR remained unmoved. He believed that the selective enforcement of laws was the root of all corruption. He was demonstrating a trait that would define his presidency, an absolute, almost reckless commitment to the rule of law over political expediency. The Assistant Secretary and the Splendid Little War. In 1897, Roosevelt's reputation for energy and reform had reached the national level. With the election of William McKinley, TR was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was a job he had prepared for his entire life. Having written the definitive history of the Naval War of 1812 at age 23, he believed that American greatness depended on a blue water navy capable of projecting power across oceans. While his boss, Secretary John Long, was often away or indecisive, Roosevelt ran the department at a fever pitch. He obsessed over target practice, coal supplies, and the promotion of aggressive officers. He believed that a conflict with Spain over the liberation of Cuba was inevitable and necessary for the American spirit. He famously told a friend, "I could welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." He viewed war not as a tragedy, but as a crucible that would prevent the American character from becoming soft and materialistic. On February 25, 1898, while Secretary Long was out for the afternoon, Roosevelt took matters into his own hands. He sent a cable to Commodore George Dewey in Hong Kong, ordering him to keep his fleet fueled and ready. If war broke out, Dewey was to immediately attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. It was a staggering usurpation of authority, effectively ordering the start of a naval campaign without president or secretarial approval. But when war was declared 2 months later, Dewey's victory at Manila Bay was a direct result of Roosevelt's unauthorized initiative. However, TR didn't just want to plan the war, he wanted to be in it. Despite the pleas of his friends and the tears of his wife, he resigned his post. He had spent years preaching the strenuous life and the virtues of military courage. He felt he could not look his children in the eye if he did not go to the front. He was a man of words who felt a desperate need to become a man of deeds. The Rough Riders and the Charge Up San Juan Hill. Roosevelt used his fame and connections to recruit the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, famously known as the Rough Riders. It was a unit that could only have been assembled by TR, a mix of Ivy League polo players, NYC policemen, and Dakota cowboys. They were the embodiment of his life's journey, the East meeting the West, the intellectual meeting the adventurer. When they arrived in Cuba, the campaign was a logistical nightmare. The heat was stifling, the food was rotten, and the Spanish were dug into high ground. On July 1, 1898, the Rough Riders faced their greatest test at the Battle of San Juan Heights. Roosevelt, the only man on a horse, his men's horse had been left behind in Florida due to transport failures, was a conspicuous target. He rode up and down the lines, waving his hat, shouting encouragements, and eventually leading the charge up Kettle Hill under a hail of Spanish Mauser fire. Men fell all around him, but Roosevelt seemed charmed. He reached the top, secured the position, and became an instant national legend. He later called it the crowded hour of his life. He returned to New York a conquering hero. The image of the bespectacled colonel in his dusty khakis was on every front page in the country. He had achieved the ultimate validation of his manhood and his philosophy. The Governor and the Shelf. The Republican bosses in New York, led by the wily Senator Thomas Easy Boss Platt, realized they could use Roosevelt's popularity to win the governorship in 1898. They didn't like him, he was too independent and too loud, but they needed his votes to save the party from a corruption scandal. Roosevelt won the election and immediately became Platt's worst nightmare. As governor, Roosevelt attacked corporate tax dodging and continued his crusade for civil service reform. He invited labor leaders to the mansion and pushed for environmental protections for the Adirondacks. Platt realized that if Roosevelt stayed in New York, he would dismantle the Republican machine piece by piece. The bosses hatched a plan to kick him upstairs to the vice presidency. In 1900, the vice president had no power. It was a ceremonial position that usually ended a politician's career. It was meant to be a shelf where Roosevelt would be quiet and forgotten. Mark Hanna, McKinley's chief advisor, was the only one who saw the danger. He famously warned his fellow Republicans, "Don't any of you realize that there's only one life between this madman and the presidency?" But the momentum was unstoppable. Roosevelt was nominated as McKinley's running mate in 1900. He campaigned with a ferocity never before seen, traveling 21,000 miles and making nearly 700 speeches. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won in a landslide. The damned cowboy in the White House. In March 1901, Roosevelt was sworn in as vice president. For 6 months, he was miserable. He contemplated going back to law school or becoming a history professor. He felt his political life was over at the age of 42. He was a man of action trapped in a role of observation. Then, on September 6, 1901, William McKinley was shot by an anarchist at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. Roosevelt rushed to Buffalo, but as the president's conditions seemed to stabilize, TR went on a hiking trip to the Adirondack Mountains. He wanted to show the public that there was no need to panic. On September 13th, while climbing Mount Marcy, a messenger reached him. McKinley was dying. Roosevelt began a midnight dash down the mountain, a terrifying ride in a buckboard wagon over rain-slicked mountain roads in the pitch black. He reached a train station, sped to Buffalo, and arrived just after McKinley had passed away. On September 14, 1901, in a modest library in a friend's house, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office. He did not use a Bible. He simply raised his hand and swore to continue absolutely unbroken the policy of President McKinley for the happiness and prosperity of our country. The path to power was complete. The boy who couldn't breathe was now the leader of the rising American empire. He had bypassed the bosses, survived the saloons, charged the hills of Cuba, and escaped the shelf of the vice presidency. Act 3 was about to begin, and the world was about to find out what happens when a man of red heat takes control of a nation's destiny. Act 3. The transition from the 19th century Gilded Age to the 20th century Progressive Era can be summarized in 3 words: Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. When he took the oath of office in 1901, the presidency was a relatively weak institution, often subservient to the whims of powerful congressional leaders and industrial titans. By the time he left in 1909, he had transformed the office into a bully pulpit, the moral and political center of American life. This section, Act 3, covers the 7.5 years where TR didn't just lead the government, he became the government. We will explore his domestic square deal, his radical approach to nature, and his aggressive big stick foreign policy. The square deal, breaking the gilded cage. Roosevelt entered the White House as a Republican, but he was a Republican of a different stripe. He believed that if the government did not address the massive inequality caused by the Industrial Revolution, the country would eventually succumb to a violent socialist revolution. His solution was the square deal, a philosophy built on 3 pillars: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protections. The Trust Buster. In 1902, TR shocked the financial world by ordering the Department of Justice to file suit against the Northern Securities Company. This was a massive railroad trust controlled by the most powerful men in America, J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. For decades, the robber barons had operated above the law. When J.P. Morgan heard about the lawsuit, he traveled to Washington and famously told Roosevelt, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man, and they can fix it up." Roosevelt's response was a historical thunderclap. "That we shall not do. We don't want to fix it up with your man. We want to stop it." The Supreme Court eventually ruled in Roosevelt's favor, dissolving the trust. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a psychological one. It established that the President of the United States, not the kings of Wall Street, was the ultimate authority in the land. He went on to initiate 44 more antitrust suits, earning him the nickname the Trust Buster. The Anthracite coal strike of 1902. In the fall of 1902, 140,000 coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike, demanding higher wages and shorter hours. As winter approached, the national coal supply plummeted, threatening to freeze American cities. In the past, presidents had sent in the army to break strikes and force men back to work. Roosevelt did something unprecedented. He invited both the union leaders and the mine owners to the White House for a summit. When the arrogant mine owners refused to even speak to the miners, Roosevelt became so incensed that he reportedly contemplated throwing the lead owner out of the window. He threatened to have the U.S. Army seize and operate the mines, not to break the strike, but to keep the country warm. The owners relented, and a commission granted the miners a 10% pay raise. This was the first time in history the federal government acted as an impartial umpire in a labor dispute. It was the birth of the square deal, a fair shake for both the laborer and the capitalist. The high priest of conservation. If Roosevelt had done nothing else, his work in conservation would have secured his place on Mount Rushmore. TR was a naturalist to his core. He saw the rapid industrialization of the West as a tragedy that was stripping the American soul of its heritage. He was not a preservationist like John Muir, who wanted to leave nature completely untouched. Roosevelt was a conservationist. He believed in the wise use of resources. He wanted to ensure that the forests, minerals, and waters of America were managed for the long-term benefit of the public, rather than being pillaged for short-term corporate profit. His achievements in this realm were staggering. He established the United States Forest Service in 1905. He signed the Antiquities Act of 1906, which allowed him to bypass Congress to protect landmarks. He used it immediately to protect the Grand Canyon and Devil's Tower. And he created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 51 federal bird reservations. The Big Stick, America on the World Stage. Roosevelt believed that the United States had a civilizing mission and that it must play a leading role in global affairs. His motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far," became the blueprint for the 20th century American foreign policy. The Panama Canal, I took the isthmus. One of Roosevelt's greatest obsessions was the creation of a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. He knew that for the U.S. Navy to be a truly global power, ships had to be able to move between the Atlantic and Pacific without sailing around South America. When Colombia, which then controlled Panama, rejected a treaty for the canal, Roosevelt didn't wait for a new one. He tactically supported a Panamanian revolution. He sent the U.S. Navy to prevent Colombian troops from landing to crush the revolt. Within days, Panama was an independent nation, and Roosevelt had his canal zone. He later boasted, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." It was an act of international police power that remains controversial today, but it reshaped global trade and military strategy forever. The Nobel Peace Prize. While he was a man of war, he was also a mastery of diplomacy. In 1905, he invited representatives from Russia and Japan to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War. He successfully brokered the Treaty of Portsmouth, preventing a total collapse of the balance of power in Asia. For this, he became the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. It was a masterclass in his big stick philosophy. He had the power of the U.S. Navy behind him, which allowed him to speak softly as a mediator. The Great White Fleet. To punctuate his presidency, Roosevelt sent 16 gleaming white battleships on a 14-month circumnavigation of the globe from 1907 to 1909. This wasn't a mission of war, but of goodwill, backed by an implicit threat. He wanted the world, and specifically the rising power of Japan, to see that the United States could project massive military force into any ocean on the planet. When the fleet returned just days before he left office, it was the crowning achievement in his imperial vision. The Legacy of Act III. The imperial presidency of Theodore Roosevelt redefined what it meant to be American. He took a country that was isolationist and inward-looking and turned it into a global superpower. He took a government that was a servant of industry and turned it into a steward of the people and the land. And he did all of this with a joy that was infectious. His friend, the diplomat Cecil Spring Rice, once said, "You must always remember that the president is about 6 years old." He meant that TR approached the presidency with the unbridled energy, curiosity, and moral certainty of a child. But behind that 6-year-old enthusiasm was a brilliant political mind that understood that the world was changing. By the time he stepped down in 1909 to go on an African safari, he had fundamentally altered the DNA of the American state. He left the arena at the height of his popularity, handing the reins to his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, believing his work was done. He was wrong. The elder lion still had one more fight left in him. Act 4. The final act of Theodore Roosevelt's life is perhaps the most Shakespearean in its trajectory. It is a story of relentless energy, a tragic political schism, a near-fatal brush with nature in its most savage form, and the heartbreaking loss of a father's greatest pride. If the presidency was TR's crowning hour, Act 4 was his long, fiery sunset, the period where the elder lion refused to retreat into the shadows, choosing instead to roar until his final breath. The Safari and the Return of the King. In March 1909, after witnessing the inauguration of his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, Roosevelt did what any man of red heat would do. He disappeared. He knew himself well enough to know that he could not remain in Washington or even New York without overshadowing the new administration. He needed a stage as large as his personality, and he found it in Africa. He embarked on a year-long scientific expedition to East Africa sponsored by the Smithsonian Institution and the National Museum. This was not a mere vacation. It was a massive logistical undertaking. Roosevelt and his son Kermit traversed the African interior, followed by a literal army of porters and scientists. They collected over 11,000 specimens, ranging from beetles and butterflies to rhinoceroses and elephants. To TR, this was the ultimate expression of his naturalist identity. He was 50 years old, but in the grasslands of Africa, he was once again the boy who established the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History in his bedroom. However, the expedition was also a physical trial. Roosevelt was no longer the young man who had charged up San Juan Hill. He suffered from bouts of fever and the lingering effects of his old injuries. Yet he pushed himself harder than men half his age. He emerged from the jungle in 1910 to a whirlwind tour of Europe. He was treated like a reigning monarch, though he held no office. He lectured at Oxford, reviewed the troops of the German Kaiser, and visited the Nobel Committee in Norway. He was the most famous man on earth. But as he moved through the gilded halls of Europe, he was receiving letters from home that left him deeply troubled. The Great Schism, the 1912 campaign. When Roosevelt landed in New York in 1910, he was greeted by a harbor full of ships and a crowd of millions. But the political landscape he returned to was unrecognizable. He had expected Taft to be his lieutenant, a man who would carry out the Rooseveltian agenda of conservation and trust busting. Instead, Taft, a man of judicial temperament who lacked TR's love for the bully pulpit, had aligned himself with the old guard of the Republican Party. The fallout between the two men is one of the greatest tragedies of American politics. It began with policy, specifically a dispute over conservation, but it ended in a clash of souls. Roosevelt felt that Taft had betrayed the progressive cause. Taft felt that Roosevelt was a megalomaniac who couldn't let go of power. By 1912, Roosevelt decided to do the unthinkable. He challenged the sitting president of his own party for the nomination. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, the drama reached a fever pitch. Roosevelt had won the vast majority of the newly created state primaries, proving he was the choice of the people. But the party bosses, led by the old guard, used their control over the convention machinery to hand the nomination to Taft. Roosevelt, incandescent with rage, did not concede. In a moment of high drama, he and his followers bolted out of the convention hall to form their own party. When a reporter asked if he was healthy enough for such a fight, Roosevelt shouted the words that gave the party its nickname, "I'm feeling like a bull moose." The Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, platform was the most radical of Roosevelt's life. He called for a new nationalism, a vision of a powerful federal government that protected the individual from the invisible government of corrupt corporations. He advocated for women's suffrage, an 8-hour workday, unemployment insurance, and a national health service. He was decades ahead of his time, effectively drafting the blueprint for what would later become the New Deal. The campaign of 1912 was the most intense of his life. It was during this run that the Milwaukee assassination attempt occurred. The bullet lodged in his chest would remain there the rest of his life, a laden souvenir of his final political charge. Despite his heroics, the math was impossible. By splitting the Republican vote with Taft, he guaranteed the election of the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt came in second, the best performance by a third-party candidate in history. But he was now a man on the outside of the gates, stripped of his party and his path back to the White House. A river of doubt, into the green hell. Depressed by his political defeat and the slow pulse of civilian life, Roosevelt looked for a new challenge that would demand everything of him. In 1913, he accepted an invitation to go to South America for a speaking tour, but he quickly turned it into a voyage of discovery. He teamed up with legendary Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon to map a previously unexplored 1,000-mile tributary of the Amazon known as the Rio Duvida, or the River of Doubt. This was not a trophy hunt. It was a descent into a green hell. The expedition was plagued by disaster from the outset. Their heavy dugout canoes were unsuitable for the churning rapids of the river. They had to be laboriously portaged through dense, vine-choked jungles while the men were eaten alive by insects. Their food supplies rotted in the tropical humidity, and they were haunted by the constant threat of hostile indigenous tribes who watched them from the shadows of the forest. Roosevelt, now 55 and carrying excess weight, suffered a deep gash in his leg while trying to prevent two canoes from being smashed against the rocks. In the unsanitary conditions of the jungle, the wound became horribly infected. Malaria and jungle fever took hold. Roosevelt's temperature spiked to 105 degrees, and he became delirious, reciting the opening lines of Coleridge's Kumbha Khan over and over again in his fever. For the first time in his life, the man of infinite energy was a liability. He was a burden to the men who he was supposed to lead. In a moment of profound despair, he begged his son Kermit to leave him behind with a lethal dose of morphine, so the rest of the party might have enough food to survive. Kermit, possessing his father's iron will, refused. Through sheer physical agony, Roosevelt was carried through the jungle. When the expedition finally reached civilization, Roosevelt had lost 50 pounds. He looked like a specter of the man who had left New York. He had made his body once as a boy, but this time the body had finally broken. He returned to America in 1914 with his health permanently shattered, his voice reduced to a raspy shadow, and his heart strained. The final charge, the Great War. As Roosevelt convalesced at Sagamore Hill, the world erupted into the First World War. For TR, this was the ultimate strenuous conflict, and he found a new target for his righteous fury, President Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt viewed Wilson's policy of neutrality as a moral failing of the highest order. He became the leading voice for preparedness, barnstorming the country to demand that America join the fight against German autocracy. When the United States finally entered the war in 1917, the 58-year-old Roosevelt went to the White House to meet with his rival, Wilson. He begged for permission to raise a division of volunteers, a new Rough Riders, to lead into the trenches of France. He didn't care about rank. He wanted to die in the arena. Wilson, fearing Roosevelt would become a political martyr or simply upstage the professional military, refused the request. It was perhaps the most painful rejection of Roosevelt's life. He was forced to watch the great adventure from his porch in Long Island. But while he could not go, his 4 sons could. He had raised them on the cult of the strenuous life, telling them that the only way to live is to be prepared to die for a cause. And in July 1918, the telegram every parent fears arrived at Sagamore Hill. His youngest son, Quentin, a daring fighter pilot, had been shot down and killed over France. The death of Quentin Roosevelt did what the asthma, the grief of 1884, and the Amazonian fever could not. It broke Theodore's spirit. He was immensely proud of his son's sacrifice, but the weight of having preached the glories of war to a boy who then died in it was a burden he couldn't shake. He began to age rapidly. Those who saw him in his final months noticed that the manic energy had been replaced by a quiet, somber dignity. The lion was tired. The end. The death of a lion. By late 1918, Roosevelt was frequently hospitalized. The jungle fever from the Amazon would flare up without warning. The inflammatory rheumatism made every movement a struggle. Yet, even as his body failed, his political star was rising. The Republican Party was beginning to unify behind him for the 1920 election. The country, weary of war and Wilsonian idealism, wanted the old lion back in the White House. But it was not meant to be. On the evening of January 5th, 1919, at his beloved home in Sagamore Hill, he spent time with his family and worked on a few last editorials. He turned to his valet, James Amos, and said his final recorded words, "James, will you please put out the light?" He died in his sleep in the early hours of January 6th. A blood clot had detached and traveled to his heart. He was 60 years old. When the news reached Washington, the reaction was one of stunned silence, followed by an outpouring of grief that transcended party lines. Vice President Thomas Marshall's tribute remains the most famous. Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight. The living legacy. Theodore Roosevelt was buried in a simple grave in Oyster Bay, overlooking the waters he had loved as a child. He didn't want a grand mausoleum. He wanted his life to be the monument. Act 4 was the period where the myth of Roosevelt was finalized. It was the period where he proved that his philosophy was not just for the young and the healthy, but for the broken and the grieving. He was the man in the arena until the very last second. He took a sickly frame and turned it into an engine of history. He took a broken heart and turned it into a shield for the American wilderness. As we conclude our time, we see that Roosevelt's final charge wasn't just about a political party or a war in Europe. It was a charge against the dying of the light. He lived 1,000 lives in 60 years, and in doing so, he taught a young nation how to be a world power, how to be a steward of the earth, and how to live with a red heat that no bullet, no fever, and no sorrow could truly extinguish. I want to take a moment and reflect on the philosophy of Roosevelt's final years, the psychology of the post-presidential Roosevelt. He was a man who suffered from a restless heart. For many, the presidency is the finish line, but for Roosevelt, it was merely the middle of the race. His obsession with the Amazon was not merely a scientific endeavor. It was an attempt to recapture the frontier spirit he felt slipping away from America. He saw the world becoming more organized, more bureaucratic, and more civilized, and he feared that the rugged individualism that built the nation was being lost. The River of Doubt was his way of proving that the strenuous life was still possible, even in the 20th century. Furthermore, his fallout with Taft provides a profound lesson in the dangers of legacy. Roosevelt believed he could control history by picking his successor, but he learned that every man must lead in his own way. His return in 1912 was an attempt to correct what he saw as a betrayal of his children, the policies of conservation and trust busting. It was a paternalistic crusade that ultimately cost him his political future, but gave birth to the modern progressive movement. In his final years, his writing became more philosophical. He reflected on the man in the arena more frequently, recognizing that his own scars, both physical and political, were the badges of a life well lived. He was no longer just the Rough Rider, he was the sage of Sagamore Hill, a man who understood that true strength comes not from never falling, but from getting up one more time than you were knocked down. His death marked the end of the Victorian era and the birth of the American century. He left behind a country that was no longer a collection of states, but a unified global power. He left behind a presidency that was no longer a passive office, but a proactive force for change. And he left behind a personal story that continues to challenge every American to dare greatly. To conclude a life as expansive as Theodore Roosevelt's is a task that requires stepping back from the specific dates of battles and bills to look at the permanent tectonic shift he caused in the American landscape. If we were to remove TR from the timeline of the 20th century, the United States would be a fundamentally different place, smaller, quieter, more fractured, and likely far less green. As we close our time together, we must ask, what remains of the bull moose today? The answer lies in three distinct arenas. the office, the earth, and the American character. The transformation of the presidency. Before Theodore Roosevelt, the American president was largely viewed as an administrator, a man who executed the will of Congress. Roosevelt inverted that hierarchy. He viewed the presidency as the bully pulpit, a unique platform from which to preach, to inspire, and to lead the national conversation. He was the first president to understand the power of the media, the first to have a dedicated press room in the White House, and the first to realize that if the president could capture the imagination of the public, Congress would have no choice but to follow. Every modern president, regardless of party, operates in the shadow of the executive activism that Roosevelt pioneered. When a president today intervenes in a national strike, proposes a sweeping environmental plan, or takes a bold unilateral action in foreign policy, they are using the tools that TR forged. He didn't just inhabit the office, he expanded its walls until they encompassed the entire globe. The steward of the future. Perhaps his most tangible legacy is the ground beneath our feet. When you stand on the rim of the Grand Canyon or walk through the silent, towering redwood cathedrals of Muir Woods, you are standing in a sanctuary created by Theodore Roosevelt's pen. He was the first national leader to suggest that a country's greatness should not be measured solely by its industrial output or its gold reserves, but by what it chooses not to destroy. He saw the vandalism of progress and stood against it. By protecting 230 million acres of public land, he ensured that the strenuous life would always be an option for future generations. He understood that a man's soul needs the wilderness to remain healthy. In an age of digital screens and urban sprawl, his conservationist legacy acts as a massive continental lung that allows the nation to breathe. The architect of the American century. Roosevelt also fundamentally redefined America's place in the world. He took a nation that was still healing from its own civil war and looking largely inward, and he forced it to look outward. Through the construction of the Panama Canal and the voyage of the Great White Fleet, he signaled that the United States was no longer a junior partner in global affairs. It was a superpower. He championed the idea that with great power comes international police power, a responsibility to intervene when human rights are violated or global stability is threatened. While his big stick diplomacy remains a subject of intense debate, there is no denying that the American century began the moment TR took the oath of office in Buffalo. He gave the United States a sense of mission and a belief that it had a moral role to play on the world stage. The man in the arena. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is the legacy of the Rooseveltian character. TR remains the ultimate antidote to cynicism. In a world that often rewards the spectator, the critic, and the cold and timid soul, Roosevelt's life is a standing order to get into the arena. His most famous words, delivered in a speech at the Sorbonne in Paris, serve as the perfect benediction for his life and for this video. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Theodore Roosevelt was a man who dared greatly every single day of his 60 years. He was a man who suffered deeply, but who refused to let his grief turn into bitterness. He was a man who held the highest power in the land, yet never lost his childlike wonder for the song of a bird or the beauty of a mountain trail. If there is one lesson to take away from our time together, it is that life is not a commodity to be hoarded, but a resource to be spent. Roosevelt lived at a red heat because he knew that the light would eventually be put out. He didn't wait for permission to be great. He didn't wait for his health to be perfect, for the politics to be easy, or for the critics to be silent. he simply charged. As we conclude, I hope you carry a bit of that bull moose spirit with you. Whether you are facing a personal struggle, a personal challenge, or a river of doubt in your own life, remember the sickly boy who made his body, the widower who found his soul in the Badlands, and the president who told us that the mighty days are the ones we create for ourselves. Theodore Roosevelt is gone, and the light in Sagamore Hill has been out for over a century. But as long as there is a trail to be hiked, a wrong to be righted, or a strenuous life to be lived, his spirit remains, vibrant, restless, and utterly, magnificently alive. I hope you enjoyed the story of the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and I'll see you next time.